We have had 2 world wars before, but before all this took place, we had another giant war that started all of this. World War Zero. Unlike European countries, Japan started to modernize much later than them. Around the year 1868, this is when Emperor Meiji has the power in his hands, and he wants to make Japan the greatest and the most advanced country in the world. The first thing he did is to create a very strong navy. But the Japanese industry wasn't that strong to create navy battleships like the Westerners, and that is why they were forced to order them from England, a country that was an ally to them. You might say, how so? Because at this time, Japan is the enemy of Russia, and Russia was the biggest threat to Britain, and that is why they happily accepted the Japanese order and sent it to them. You have to know that the Russian Navy was very strong at that point, but not in every water. They had a lot of battleships in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, but nothing on the east side next to Japan. In the year 1860, the Russians have a war with the Chinese and conquer all the way to Vladivostok. Since Vladivostok was near the Japanese border, they decided to create a navy base there. They also do something huge. They run a massive railroad track all the way from Moscow to Vladivostok, which is insane. It goes pretty much 1/3 of the entire size of Earth. There's a lot of tension between Russia and Japan. And right next to them, there is another enemy that's giant, China. China is looking out for them, and they don't want to be held back. They want to keep up. At this time, China is the only country that is not cool with the Japanese or the Russians. And they're not cool with the Europeans except the Germans, which they have a relationship with. And that is why when China saw that the Russians and the Japanese have brought naval bases right in their front yard, they started to worry, and they made a deal with the Germans to buy some battleships. In the year 1894, since China was getting tired of the Japanese tension created in this part of the world, they decided to attack them. It seems like China wasn't watching out for Japan because they had been building their navy for over 30 years now, so they were ready for a battle like this. And that is why it was extremely embarrassing for China to get defeated by a tiny Asian nation that wasn't a threat a century ago. This defeat causes Japan to get control of the Korean Peninsula, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the Taiwan Island. Why is Liaodong so important? Because it's an extremely strategic location, and whoever has control over here has a lot of power, and of course, controlling the Korean Peninsula was the best part out of all of them. Nicholas II, that was the Tsar of the Russian Empire, was extremely upset that China did this. Why did they give such important locations to Japan? France and Germany support the Russian and tell the Chinese that they shouldn't have done this. Since the Russians were feeling feisty, they decided to take Navy ships and go take over the Liaodong Peninsula. And they successfully do so. The Japanese don't do anything because it's not time yet to fight the Russians. Russia takes over Liaodong, and it's an embarrassment for Japan. Since Britain was wishing for the defeat of Russia, they suggest to the Japanese to buy more Navy ships, and that is why 4 more Navy battleships are sent Japanese way. When the Russians realize that Japan is buying a whole lot of weapons, they send a lot that way, especially towards the Liaodong Peninsula. With all this tension building up, war was inevitable. Even Britain knew this, and that is why in the year 1902, they formed an alliance with the Japanese Empire, and they basically had their support in any type of war. Both the Russians and the Japanese knew that if there is a battle, it's gonna be a battle with the ships. So all they were doing is building weapons and forming strategies on how to win in the water. Since the Japanese had British technology in their hands, they were very equal to the power of the Russian Navy, and that is why whoever wanted to win had to have the best strategy possible, and whoever makes mistakes is the one that gets defeated. We finally get to February 8th, 1904, when the Japanese battleships attack the Liaodong Peninsula, where the Russians are located in. The Japanese battleship approach the Russian base at night and start shooting torpedo, and when war breaks loose, all the Russians get ready and start fighting back. And when the Japanese realize that it's getting serious, their commander orders them to get back, because the commander realized that if they stay there for too long, there's a chance of the battleships to be sunk. The Russians don't chase, because the commander they had, called Makarov, ordered them to stay put, because if we chase, it's gonna be a trap. It's better if we stay here and protect the peninsula. The next day, the Japanese commander orders his men early in the morning to go around the peninsula where the Russians don't see them and start attacking them from behind. The Russians had no idea what the Japanese had planned, so they got hit by surprise. So in this battle, the Russians were heavily defeated. After this happened, the Japanese commander told his men to put mines all over the area in case the Russians wants to chase us or if they want to attack the Japanese shore. When two Russian ships started chasing the Japanese, they were hit with a mine and they sunk to the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese had a plan for the other ships. They had them stay put in an area where they can block them off and hit them one by one. We get to June 23rd, 1904. The Russians are getting tired of the Liaodong Peninsula and they want to leave the strait and go back to Vladivostok. When the Japanese realize that's what the Russians want, they tell their men, absolutely not. Don't let one of their ships pass. So they decide to attack the Liaodong Peninsula. The goal of the Japanese was to withhold the Russian ships and block them instead of letting them pass through. Eventually, on the 2nd of January 1905, the Japanese had finally taken control of the Liaodong Peninsula. They sink all the Russian ships and not one passes through to go back to Vladivostok. Since the Russians were heavily defeated, they were embarrassed, so they decided to send their best battleships from the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea so they can protect the eastern side. But all this equipment and ship has to pass by the Tsushima Strait, and it's all in the control of the Japanese. On the 26th of May 1905, the Russian ships are getting close to the strait and they're trying to pass by so they can get to Vladivostok. But there's no way that they could hide themselves in the Japanese eye. The Japanese commander, using a telegraph, tells all his men that the Russians are here and we need to form a single file line in front of them. He tells all of them to form a group in the Tsushima Strait. The commander, called Commander Togo, tells his men to stay put in the middle of the strait. He told his men to also park the ships perpendicular to the Russians coming up, because the ships could only shoot from their side and they only had turrets to the front. So it was a huge advantage for the Japanese rather than the Russians. So when the Russian ships do actually show up, they get smoked. In a span of 4 hours, 5 of the most important Russian ships are sunk to the bottom of the ocean, and that's insane for 4 hours. In this battle, not only do the Russians lose Liaodong Peninsula, they lose 21 battleships. 7 of them are taken over by the Japanese Navy, and this is in a way where the Japanese only lost 3 ships. Since the Russians didn't want to lose Vladivostok, they decided to raise the white flag and surrender to the Japanese. This was one of the worst things that could happen to Russia, and it was all blamed on Nicholas II. In other ways, the world would make fun of him, since the most powerful empire in the world has lost to a tiny Asian nation. And in another way, the people of Russia are embarrassed about their government. This was pretty much the first time that the Russian army was defeated when they wanted to expand their territory in the world. And this was one of the main reasons that Bolshevism was starting to take place and they were gaining traction. And if you would like to know more about it, please watch our video about how Nicholas II was taken over. Why was this war named World War Z anyways? Because this is the war that started the thought of World War I. The Russians were so embarrassed and their government was so out of place for the very first time, and that caused a chain reaction when a random Serbian kills Archduke Ferdinand. The Germans realized that they could take advantage of this, and they attacked the Russians and the French at the same time and began World War I. 9 years after the end of World War Z,